Today I get the privilege of concluding our series, Do You Hear What I Hear? And we've been looking in this series at some of the minor prophets. And the minor prophets are the prophets at the very end of the Old Testament. And today we're actually going to the very, very end. And we're going to talk from the book of Malachi. Or as the joke I often heard growing up, Malachi, the Italian prophet. But I've never heard Joel make that joke, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. Malachi this morning, and so we're going to look at Malachi this morning. And so if you turn in your Bibles, you can get there. We're gonna overview the entire book. And so buckle your seatbelts. We'll be here for the next little while. And but no, we're going to look at the entire book, but you can find Malachi just before the book of Matthew, just before the New Testament. Or maybe you're using the internet this morning on your smart device to find it, and that way you can just put in the words Malachi. But the internet is great for many reasons, isn't it? One, you can get the Bible anywhere you want if you have your phone with you. The internet allows us to keep better contact with our world. My children don't really know what a phone is. They do, but whenever Ella talks on the phone, she's like, do you see this? Do you see this? Because she's used to using FaceTime. Because she talks to her grandparents on FaceTime all the time, and she can see them. And so the internet allows us to keep better contact with people. We can contact people who are farther away for free, and it's amazing that the internet allows us to do. The internet gives us access to games and music and movies and more. The internet provides us with a lot of information. Now, there is a downside to the internet. It involves that information. You can't always trust what you find on the internet. At least I find that I often come across things on the internet that I just have a little doubt in my mind when I see these things. It becomes particularly relevant on social media, especially Facebook, because on Facebook, people will see an article on the internet, they will see the title of it, they won't read anything in the article, and they will just share it for the world to know. Like, oh, have you heard that? I got to let people know about this without ever checking the information. And so on Facebook, if you're on Facebook, maybe you've come across some of these articles recently or some of these posts on your Facebook news feed recently. In case you didn't know, McDonald's is getting rid of the Big Mac. This came up in the last week on Facebook. McDonald's is going to get rid of the Big Mac. It's an official tweet, right? It looks like an official tweet, minus the fact that they don't have proper grammar, which probably should give you a little bit of doubt. But McDonald's is apparently getting rid of the Big Mac. Their signature hamburger, they're getting rid of it. Also on the internet this week, Pastor Chris actually let me know about this one. There's a man who's 179 years old living in India. 179. That's like more than 5 times my age. It's a long time. But apparently he's living, there's documentation on it. And this one's particularly good. This one goes around every couple of years on Facebook. Bill Gates is apparently giving away $5,000 to every person who shares this picture. So you might want to get on your phone right now, find it, because that could solve a lot of problems. In fact, if you can't read it, it says, as some of you may know, I'm Bill Gates. If you click that share link, I will give you $5,000. I always deliver. I mean, I brought you Windows XP, right? And so my immediate reaction to all 3 of these articles, all 3 of these posts was, I doubt that. I doubt that McDonald's is giving up their Big Mac. I doubt that there's a man who's 179 years old in India. I doubt that Bill Gates is just going to give away his money. He didn't become that rich by giving everything away for people who do absolutely nothing except share something on Facebook. And you know what? I looked up all of these articles. I went on a website called Snopes.com, which gives you information about things that show up on the internet. And the reality is that I was right to doubt the trustworthiness of all of these things. None of these things are true. McDonald's is not giving up their Big Mac. Don't worry. You can still enjoy it. You're not gonna get $5,000 from Bill Gates, and there is not a 179-year-old man living in India. In fact, that article comes from a fake news site that just makes up fake news because they think it's fun, and so you find things on there all the time that make little sense, and you have many reasons to doubt. But you know what? I'm thinking about doubt this morning, and it raises an important question for all of us, a question that we need to ask ourselves this morning. Do we ever doubt God? Do I ever doubt God? Do you ever doubt God? If the answer is yes, you wouldn't be the first. In fact, the people of Israel have a long history of doubting God. They doubted God's provision in the desert when they had been freed from slavery. God miraculously freed them from slavery, took them through a body of water by separating it. They doubted God's provision, that he wouldn't be able to provide food and water for them. And they wanted to go back and live in slavery because they would get food and water. You know, they doubted God's promise. When they came to the promised land, they sent some spies, 12 spies into the land to see what it was like. And 2 of them came back and said, you know what? God promised us this land. God is going to come through and we can take it. But 10 of them came back and said, you know what? The people there are too big. They're too strong. They're too well fortified. Their armies are too big. We can't do this. God will not come through on his promise. They doubted God. All except one of them doubted God when they were faced with a giant of a man named Goliath. And they all cowered in fear except for one little boy, because they doubted that God had the power to save them when they faced this giant. And yet in all these situations, each and every one of them, God came through. God provided the food and water they needed. God fulfilled his promise and gave them the promised land. And God overpowered the giant Goliath and gave them the victory. And yet the people of Israel continued to struggle with doubt. In the time of Malachi, the people that he's writing to, the people of Israel had begun to doubt again. This time they had begun to doubt God's love. They didn't think that God loved them anymore. Now you must understand a bit of their story. The people of Israel had lived in the promised land for years, but they had been disobedient to God. And particularly the people of Israel had been exiled from their homeland. They had been taken from where they lived, taken from some of them, taken from everyone, moved to another country and forced to live there, no longer free, but under the power of another nation. And so they had been taken from their home, but God had brought back a remnant of Jewish people to Jerusalem. And in the book of Ezra, you read about this remnant of people, and God helps them rebuild the temple. And then in the book of Nehemiah, you read that God helps them rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. And so now they've been brought back to their homeland. They have a little bit of freedom. They're still under the rule of the Persian nation, but they have a temple to worship God in, and they have the safety of a wall around their city. And yet, with all these things that they could be thankful for, with much to be thankful for, and all these things that God had provided for them, when Malachi writes to this remnant of people, doubt had crept back in. See, Malachi was perhaps the last prophet to write in the Old Testament. Although the people he wrote to had experienced all these great things, all this provision from God, they felt that it lacked the miracles that God had performed when he saved the people of Israel from Egypt. And yet, the reality is that everything that happened was a miracle. You read the story of Ezra, you read the story of Nehemiah, and you will see God's miraculous provision. But to these people, their expectations had not been met. Their expectations were still waiting to be met. See, the people that Malachi wrote to, they had heard the other prophecies. They had heard what prophets like Zechariah and Haggai had written, because they had already been written. They knew that their city, that Jerusalem, was supposed to be a place of peace and prosperity. They knew that their city was supposed to be a city that kings would visit, a city that would be renowned because the presence of their great and glorious God would be in their city. They had heard the prophecies of the coming Messiah who would set them free and rule them once again as a free people. But it had been years since Zechariah declared, "This is what the Lord Almighty says, my towns will again overflow with prosperity, and the Lord will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem." It had been years since these people had heard about the Messiah that was to be born in Bethlehem, that would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. It had been years since these things had prophesied, and nothing had happened. They remembered these words, and yet it must have seemed like cruel mockery to know those words and to see the current state of their city. You see, Jerusalem was a city that struggled with its basic needs. It was suffering from drought and pestilence. Even though they had returned from exile, Jerusalem still remained an insignificant territory. No Messiah had arrived. No one had come to set them free. They still lived under the rule of a foreign power. With all these promises from these other prophets, and yet no action, no deliverance, no change, no miraculous intervention from God, what were they to think? God had obviously turned his back on his promise. It was obvious that God didn't love them anymore, so you can understand why doubt would creep in. In fact, if you're anything like me, you've probably been through it yourself. Now, it likely didn't happen to us because of a foreign power ruling over our land and seemingly empty promises of restoration. But perhaps you've experienced it in the form of a promise that God would provide for your needs, and yet you've been months without a job. Maybe for some of us, it was the idea and the promise that God would restore to you your child who has gone wayward, who has gone down the wrong path, and yet after months and even years of praying, your child is still heading down a destructive path. Maybe for you, maybe for some of us, it's come in the form of a promise that God would grant us children, and yet our house still remains empty. I could go on with different types of promises of health and safety and blessings, promises of spiritual intimacy, and yet they all go unfulfilled. For others of us, we doubt that God could love us. We doubt that God could forgive us after all the things that we've done. Or we doubt that God cares about an insignificant person like me. Just as the Israelites began to doubt God's promises because his promises had been long unfulfilled, doubt begins to creep into our hearts and our lives. When we reach a place where we doubt God's promises, his love and his provision and his care, there's a tendency for us to compromise. If God isn't living up to his end of the bargain, why should we? God's not doing what he said he was going to do, so why am I going to do what he wants me to do? Why am I going to live up to my end of the bargain? This is what was happening to the people in the days of Malachi. This is what was happening to the people of Judah. They'd begun to doubt that God loved them. They'd begun to doubt his promises, and so they began to compromise their relationship with God. The compromise comes in three different ways that Malachi mentions. First, they began to compromise their worship. In Malachi's day, the people were expected to sacrifice animals to God. And this was part of their worship to God and part of the forgiveness of sins and the whole sacrificial system. But instead of offering God the very best of their flock, the firstborn lamb or the firstborn goat, instead of offering the firstborn, they began to offer the sick, the blind, and the maimed. They offered God the animals that were useless to them. Instead of giving God the honor due his name, they compromised and gave him second-rate offerings to worship him. They didn't give God what he deserved, and what he deserves is their very best or our very best. Instead, they had become half-hearted, careless, and indifferent in their worship. See, for us, we start to compromise our worship in many different ways. For some of us, we allow other people, other activities, and other things to take the place and the prominence that only God deserves in our lives. Others of us compromise our worship by talking the talk, by saying the right things, knowing what to say, but when it comes to living it out, we don't walk the walk. And our actions don't back up our words. See, the Bible says that a worshiper must worship in spirit and in truth. Our lives back up our words in worship. Our lives must back up our words in worship. We must ask ourselves today, have we let compromise affect our worship of God? Have we let compromise affect our worship of God? The next thing we read that the people of Judah began to compromise their relationships. See, Malachi writes in chapter 2, verse 10, "Why do we profane the covenant of our ancestors by being unfaithful to one another?" We spit on the covenant that we made with God, that our ancestors made in God, when we are unfaithful to one another. Malachi points out two specific ways that they're being unfaithful. One, they were starting to marry people who served other gods. They were beginning to enter relationships of people who served foreign gods. They were willing to compromise their own faith, their own relationship with God, by entering into a romantic relationship with someone who served another god. Second, God calls them out for being unfaithful to their wives, for being unfaithful to their spouses, their partners in their marriage covenant. See, they had begun to compromise their relationship in ways that brought dishonor to God's name. They brought dishonor to God's name. See, for us, it's pretty straightforward. We do very similar things in our relationships. We compromise our relationships when we mistreat one another. When we curse our brother or sister who is made in the image of God, we compromise our relationships and we don't act in a way that brings honor to God's name. See, for those of us who are unmarried here this morning, we can fall into compromise in our relationships when we begin to think, you know what? That person is so attractive, it doesn't matter what they believe. we can get through that. We can work through the differences. They're just so attractive. And that's when we begin to look at only physical traits, and we miss that we have differing beliefs, we begin to compromise our relationship. Not just our relationships with one another, but we begin to compromise our relationship with God. God calls us into committed relationships that are based on a mutual relationship with Christ. And when Christ is not the center of our relationship, it can lead us to compromise our relationship with God. For those of us this morning who are married, we compromise our relationships with our spouse when we enter into relationships with someone else. And those can come in three ways. One, physical. The most often when we think about compromising our relationship, we think about adultery. We think about a physical relationship with someone who is not your spouse. And certainly that is an issue in our world, and a way that is a huge compromise. But you know what? There's other ways that we compromise our relationship with our spouse. One is emotionally. Our spouse is supposed to be not just our physical partner, but our emotional partner. And when we enter into an emotional relationship with someone of the opposite sex that fulfills our emotional needs in a way that only our spouse should, then we are being unfaithful to our marriage. It's something we need to be watchful and careful of. Another way that we compromise our marriages is when we look at images and videos and we read articles and books that are in order to fulfill sexual desire in our life that should only be fulfilled by our spouse. So pornography, novels that are far too involved in their descriptions. When we seek sexual desire from items and things that are not our spouse, then we are being unfaithful in our relationship. We are being unfaithful to God. And we're compromising our relationship with God. See, lastly, we read that the people of Malachi's day began to compromise their obedience. God calls the people out for robbing him. And the people are like, "What, God, what are you talking about? How are we robbing you?" And God says, "In my tithes and offerings." In tithes and offerings, you're not giving back to me. So you must understand that God, in the early books of the Old Testament, had called his people to be faithful in their tithes. That they need to be faithfully giving to God in tithes and offerings. And these people had begun to compromise their obedience because they had stopped giving. They had stopped giving. It was a requirement for them to give, and by not doing so, they were being disobedient to God. When doubt creeps in, it is easy to begin to compromise our obedience to God. See, now for some of us, that compromise of obedience might come in the form of finances, and making sure that if we're not to compromise, then we need to make sure we give our tithes and our offerings. But for others, our compromise in obedience looks different. For some of us, it's ignoring God's voice when he whispers his words in our ear. Maybe that whisper was for you to ask your coworker if you could pray for them. When you ignore that whisper, you compromise your obedience. For others, it was a whisper to share about the difference that God had made in your life with your fellow student when they were talking about the tough situation they were going through. When we ignore those types of whispers, we compromise our obedience. Maybe that whisper was to strike up a conversation with someone you see on a regular basis. Maybe you sit beside them on the bus. Maybe you sit with them in the cafeteria. Maybe you see them at the grocery store every week when you go through the same checkout line. And God is just whispering, talk to them. Love them. When we ignore those whispers, we compromise our obedience to God. See, we compromise our obedience to God when we fall short of God's best for our lives. When we begin to do things that are sin, we're compromising our obedience to God. Amidst all of this compromise, amidst the compromise of the people of Judah, and amidst all of their doubt of God's love and whether God even cared for them now, Malachi's message to the people of Judah was a reminder that God does not change. If God promised to restore Jerusalem, if God had promised to send his Messiah, then God will deliver. Because God does not change. And when God has told you what he is going to do, God will do it. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God does not change. See, if the people could trust him to get them out of Egypt, then you could trust him to send his Messiah. If you could trust God to provide for you 10 years ago, then you can trust God to provide for you today, because God does not change. If you could trust God to love you before you made that big mistake, then you can trust God to love you even after you have. God does not change. We can trust him. If we could trust him in 2014, then we can trust him in 2015. God does not change. What a wonderful truth this morning. God is not flippant. He doesn't go back and forth. He doesn't move around like the shifting shadows. God does not change. He remains the same today. He remains the same. And if God has made a promise, then God will fulfill that promise. In closing this morning, I'm going to call the band to come back up. God is a God of faithfulness. And all he asks for us is for us to remain faithful. If God is going to be faithful, all he asks is that we would be faithful. See, in Malachi 4:4, we read, "Remember the law of your servant Moses, the decrees and the laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel." In other words, remember your part of the covenant. Remember your part of the bargain. Remember what you're supposed to do. Rid yourselves of the compromise that you've fallen into and return to a right relationship with God. This morning we need to rid ourselves of the compromise, of our compromised worship, and we need to worship God in spirit and in truth. This morning we need to rid ourselves of the compromised relationships and then live in relationships that bring honor to God's name. We need to rid ourselves of compromised obedience and be fully committed to him. See, then Malachi, after saying this, Malachi prophesies and says, "See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." See, the people of Judah, they had heard the promises that a Messiah was coming. And he hadn't come yet, but he was coming. And Malachi reminds them, God does not change. The Messiah is still coming. And the reality is that a few days ago, we celebrated the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. God came through on his promises for the people of Judah, and God will come through on his promises for you and for me. Whatever God says, we can take it to the bank as truth. We can say yes and amen. Because Jesus was born, Jesus lived and died and set the people free from their sin. God sent his Messiah and he fulfilled his promise. This morning, as we reflect on 2014 and prepare our hearts for 2015, we must be reminded that we serve a great God, a trustworthy God, a faithful God, and all his people. And as his people, we are called to respond to him without compromise. See, at home, I have my daughter Ella. She's 3 years old. And some days, when I'm at work, she's at home and she wants to play with a toy. You know, it might be her star-shaped cookie, and she can't find it, and she'll say, "Mommy, I can't find the star-shaped cookie. Where is it? Where is it?" And Kate will help her look all over the house for it, and she will try to find this cookie, and then Kate will say, "You know what, Ella, we can't find the cookie right now," and Ella will turn to Kate and say, "Mommy, it's okay. When Daddy gets home, he'll find it." Or, you know, one day Ella's princess crown broke, and Kate said, "You know, Ella, I can't fix it. It's okay, Mommy. When Daddy gets home, he'll fix it." See, if my daughter can trust me, a sinful, faithless human being, then how much more can we trust our Father in heaven when he makes a promise? So, you know, this morning you might be thinking, you know, I've compromised, I've made mistakes. The reality is we're about to sing a song full of truth that says that our past is behind us, and this morning we are moving forward. In 2015, we are moving forward, and we are going to trust God with everything because God is trustworthy. Maybe in the past we haven't been like Ella. We haven't had the trust in our Father that we should have. Well, in 2015, we can trust God because God does not change.